So on to our first panel. Captain Brian Shury is Vice President of ALPA International's Canada Board, and he's going to moderate our first panel on competition in Canada's airline industry. Over to you, Brian.
Morning, everyone. Our first panel today is going to examine some of the important competitive issues facing Canadian airlines, and more specifically, how we at ALPA believe some of our fees and taxes have hindered our airlines' ability to grow and compete effectively in both domestic and international markets. As Captain Knoll indicated earlier, our sector plays a large and vital role in the Canadian economy. Structures and policies must be in place to promote the healthy growth and competitiveness in this sector. Obviously, that is in our members' interest as well. Professional pilots depend on the fact that we have healthy, robust air carriers, not just because that facilitates our ability to bargain adequate and fair compensation, but it also allows us to do something much more important. And that is to bring an even stronger focus to the areas of safety and security. When air carriers are doing well, there's simply more money to be spent on all of the issues surrounding safety and security, and that is a benefit to all stakeholders. Much of my experience in the industry has been in the area of labor relations and negotiations, where we as pilot representatives find a natural and normal adversarial tension with the industry, to some degree. In the realm of fair competition, however, we in the industry find our interests are almost perfectly aligned. We were very encouraged a few years ago when the Senate Committee on Transport and Communications issued its report titled One Size Doesn't Fit All. The committee amplified what we had been saying and continue to say with respect to many of the issues around fees and taxation in our country. The airline industry seems to suffer from capitalism roller coaster air sickness more than most. We are the first to reach for the sick bag when the economy falters, and we are the last ones to put the sick bag away after the economic recovery. This economic sensitivity is made much more acute because of an unbalanced tax and fee system, resulting in razor-thin profit margins. One might think we're asking to be treated differently as a result. Quite the opposite is true. We are asking to be treated the same as other transportation industries. For example, the user pay concept applied to the aviation sector does not apply to any of the other transportation sectors, such as rail, ferry, or even roadways, to nearly the degree it does for us. This obviously hurts us domestically in terms of consumer transportation choices. Many other countries do not treat their airline industries in this user pay fashion, which hurts us in our ability to compete on transborder and international routes. A few examples of some of the more hobbling of the user pay charges that need to be addressed are airport ground rents, air traveler security charges, airport improvement fees, Nav Canada service fees, and fuel excise taxes. All of these issues are addressed in the recent CTA review and subsequent recommendations that are currently being reviewed by Minister Garneau. Our four panel members will cover the CTA review in more detail in their presentations shortly. Cross-border airfare shopping has been one of the negative results of our industry taxation system. This trend has been muted to some degree lately by the struggling loonie, but nevertheless, the Conference Board of Canada believes that there's approximately 5 million Canadians per year that are deciding to drive to U.S. border cities to begin their travel, either within the U.S. or to other international destinations. The board also claims this: when adding fees and taxes that apply to the base fare, we find that Canadian fees and taxes contribute to roughly 40% of the total airfare difference in the markets that we examined. At the opposite end of the competitive spectrum, we have the Gulf carriers who benefit from massive government subsidization and have literally turned the UAE into a global superhub, and they are poised for much more significant growth. The Canadian government has been successful up to now in limiting the access of the Gulf carriers to our markets, but they have had to pay a political price for doing so. The pressure will only increase as Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways continue their expansion into North American markets. Our ALPA carriers and colleagues to the south are fighting a particularly pitched battle on this front, and we are working closely with them and industry to insist on fair levels of competition. There are other real competitive threats as well, which this panel may not have time to consider, but certainly deserves mention. The threat of new emerging business models from Europe, such as Norwegian Airlines International, or commonly referred to as NAI. This is a model loosely based on the maritime model of flags of convenience. In this case, NAI is a Norwegian company that is headquartered in Norway, but its operating certificate, read oversight, is held in Ireland. The pilots are hired under contract by a company in Singapore and are not subject to the labor laws of Norway. NAI has been successful in obtaining the initial DOT approval for access to U.S. markets, and we believe it will only be a matter of time before they will turn their attention to Canadian markets. This is an airline business model that needs to be closely monitored because if allowed to flourish, will have a lasting and devastating impact on the airline industry. So on that happy note, it is now my pleasure to introduce this morning's panelists to you. On my far left is Mr. Daniel Gooch. He's the president of the Canadian Airports Council. Sitting next to him is Mr. John McKenna, president of the Air Transportation Association of Canada. Sitting next to John is Mr. Marc-André O'Rourke, the executive director of the National Airlines Council of Canada. And last but not least, Mr. Fred Lazar, associate professor of the Department of Economics at York University. There's an arm wrestling competition that was held earlier this morning. Fred won the arm wrestling competition, and he is going to present first. And how we would like to do this is we'll have the panelists do a short presentation for you. After the presentations are complete, we'll open it up for questions and answers. So Fred, if you would, please.
Thank you. I should correct him. I didn't win the competition. They asked for a volunteer to stand forward. I stood my ground. Everybody else stood backwards, and I got it that way. Let me preface my comments, and I'll try to keep them short, as follows. We all know the issues. We all know the solutions. They're straightforward. What's the problem? The problem is twofold. One, politicians and economists. That it's taken so long to even begin to make some headway makes no sense whatsoever. Anyhow, the CTA review. The terms of reference I've just highlighted two parts: vitality of the Canadian aviation sector and competitive global markets. So what did the CTA review target? Following objectives: increasing competition, supporting improving the health of the air transport sector in Canada. There seems to be some sort of conflict there, but obviously the review was not aware of this, and the economists that advised them obviously not aware of the conflict, and supporting and strengthening governance in this sector. Would be nice, it's about time, but I'm not holding my breath. CTA review, systems marked by weak accountability, constraints on fees and charges. Absolutely right. High cost for users and operators. Absolutely right. Aggressive capital expenditure programs at airports. Again, absolutely right. Limited competition. Well, as I said, they almost got it right. So what do we know? We know the following. Direct and indirect taxes. So I don't have to sort of go through this. We all know the different types of taxes, the magnitude of the taxes. They've been around for a long time. The importance of hub carriers. We should know this. Government, politicians somehow don't quite understand this, although there's been some improvement. And as I point out, consider Dubai without Emirates. Would anyone have ever heard of Dubai? Would anyone ever care? Think of Atlanta without Delta. Atlanta would be a second, third-rate destination. Hub carriers are critical. What else do we know? The importance of connectivity for productivity. There have been a number of studies that have shown that airlines, by increasing connectivity, contribute considerably to productivity levels and productivity growth. What does economic theory tell us? We should be subsidizing those activities that have these positive externalities. Now, I'm not advocating we subsidize the aviation industry, but we shouldn't be taxing it. So there's a disconnect here. Economists who, again, advise the government ignore this fundamental principle. Governance is pathetic at airports. I mean, the airport structure that was set up when Chrétien was Prime Minister, the not-for-profit airport authorities, and the representation of the board of directors never made any sense. Governance in the private sector, not much better. Corporate governance in general is a problem. Hopefully moving forward, we'll correct governance at airports. Governance in the private sector is another issue. No regulatory oversight of capital investment and fees. Now everyone focuses on the airport rents, the security fees, but a big problem, and one of the major reasons Pearson is being a high-cost airport is because of the grandiose vision and plans of the original CEO and the total lack of constraint on investment expenditures. Now, if you look at the GTAA, what were the original plans? $3 to $4 billion. At the peak, the debt was almost $8 billion. So it was double the original plans, and there was never any oversight. You look at the interest payments, they far exceed the rents that are paid. That was a major problem, a major contributor to the high-cost structure of airports in this country. Limited competition globally. This is what we should know. How many global alliances are there? 3. What does this tell us? You're not going to get a 4th or 5th alliance. It's just not going to happen. You look at Europe, you look at the US, consolidation. You have a limited number of players worldwide. We've been talking in Canada for decades about trying to stimulate more competition. It's not going to happen. There's only room for so many carriers in this country. Essentially, 2.5, ignoring the North, which is a separate issue. But yet, CTA review is under the delusion that we can get more competition in this country. Going forward, what do we need to do? Obviously, getting rid of economic rents. I would also suggest that the government compensates the GTAA for when Chrétien decided to end the privatization of Terminal 3, he dumped almost $900 million of the cost onto the GTAA. And we as travelers continue to pay for that political decision. Eliminate security fees. Again, it's a national issue. It's not an airline-specific issue. Change governance structure at airports. Absolutely. Get rid of these local representatives that basically don't do anything and get real people on the boards. Big data and CATSA. Private sector is going the area of big data, CATSA is not. We don't use the data available. Why? For political correctness. Technology, RFID technology, facial recognition. I think we all sort of go through sort of the security system at airports, and every time I go through, I wonder what the people that are looking at the computer screens are really looking for. And are the security threats the ones there in the terminals or are they elsewhere? So there's a lot of technology that can be implemented very quickly to improve security, improve the experience. Level playing fields. See, the problem with the airline industry is we're not covered by the GATT. If we were covered by the GATT, we wouldn't have to worry about the Gulf carriers. They wouldn't be operating. They'd be hit with countervailing duties, but we're not. So we don't have level playing fields. This is going to create additional problems going forward. Also going forward, climate change. Regardless of your views, the train has left the station. Carbon taxes are going to become increasingly more pronounced, and they're going to increase in value. Why is this a problem? Well, if the EU, the US, Canada moves down this path, this is going to create an unlevel playing field. What about airlines from other countries that are not subject to the same taxes? What do we do with them? Do we consider them as being beneficiaries of unfair subsidies, which would be the case. How do we respond? So this is going to be an important issue. Privatization. Well, keep this in mind. If the government decides to privatize, what are they going to do? They'll tell private investors, we're going to get rid of the economic rents. So we're all going to applaud. There's a problem here. All that's going to do is increase the value, the prices offered for these airports, so those rents are going to be capitalized in these values, and we're going to continue paying those rents to the new owners. The only way we get around this is you eliminate the rents altogether. The government's going to have to take a hit if they privatize. But privatization will also increase the cost of capital. And then going forward, we ignore the drivel of self-serving airlines. This is Qatar. This is a quote I think they presented to the CTA. I have a very long letter from Emirates where they threatened me for all types of things because I exposed a number of subsidies that they were beneficiaries of. So the CTA, they got certain things right. No need to sort of go through this. Let me focus on what they got wrong. Policy governing air transport has yielded excellent airport facilities, air navigation systems, and financially sound carriers. What if oil had continued to be over $100 US a barrel for the past few years? Would we be talking about financially sound carriers here in Canada or south of the border? I doubt it. So our policy has not contributed to that. We've been lucky because of oil prices. Privatization of airports, I've discussed that. Light touch regulation. We gave these airport authorities monopoly power and taxing powers with no regulatory oversight. I've always said, where can I get a monopoly and taxing powers? I'll be at the front of the line to get this. You cannot give monopoly power and taxing powers without regulatory oversight. Adopt policies, et cetera, et cetera. Again, CTA has got that wrong. Minimum allowance for 7 flights per week in all new and existing air agreements. Why is this? Because the Gulf carriers, Turkish Airlines, have complained. So let's concede to them. Well, that gets into the views on competition and level playing fields. And the views on competition are driven by economists, and economists have been consistently wrong in their views on competition. And then finally, consumer protection and compensation. This is really a paternalistic approach. Do we really have to protect consumers against their own ignorance and stupidity? I have my doubts about that, but obviously for political reasons, when a consumer doesn't read the fine print or can't understand the fine print, and I'm a firm believer that we should have a minimum IQ standards for people to travel. It would make travel a lot easier for all of us. Unfortunately, the government doesn't have the same view. Anyhow, those are my views. Thank you very much.
I often wish Professor Lazar would really tell us how he feels about things. So. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour. First of all, thank you very much to ALPA and Dan. And Dan, thanks for the reception yesterday. It was a great chance to meet the minister and some of your colleagues. I also want to take a minute to thank Dan and John and Daniel as well. Where we can, we often like to work together, our members, the airports, John's members, on issues such as laser strikes and UAVs. So I think we hear that a lot. When we're able to bring all these stakeholders together on an issue, it really has a lot more impact than if it's just one particular party talking about something. So thank you for that. So very briefly, if you're not aware of who the National Airlines Council of Canada is, we are the voice of Canada's large airlines. Our 4 members are Air Canada, Air Transat, Jazz, and WestJet. And we talk about 3 baskets of priorities. And I often skip over the safe and secure because it seems so obvious, but I really want to emphasize that that is really our members' priorities, and this is not news to you here. But everything we do, everything our members do is towards a safe and secure air travel. The second priority, environmentally responsible air travel. There's no question that this government, this new government in particular, is taking an aggressive position on climate change. And I think we're quite lucky as an industry. We do have a great story to tell. We have a great record. We haven't done a fantastic job of tooting our own horn. And it sounds a bit disingenuous now to talk about it, but it's not at all, because this is something we've been doing for several years. The next big leap will be in alternative fuels, and that's why we're encouraged with the new government and their commitment to clean energy. So we obviously want to work with them on de-risking initial investments, improving research and development in that area. So we're looking forward to working with the government, and we have a great story to tell as an industry, and we will be doing so. The third basket of priority is competitive air travel. And I like talking about two different prongs of having competitive air travel. There's the competitiveness from the cost perspective and the taxes and fees, which we're all aware of, but there's also being competitive from the passenger experience perspective, making sure that the whole experience from not only curb to gate, but from couch to gate. So when you make the decision to come to Canada or come to a country, that it's easy to get the visa, or you just make it easy to come to Canada to do business and trade here. Go through our airports very seamlessly. So those are things that make Canada a world-class attractiveness if it has a reputation and it takes aviation seriously, and you can get through our airports in record time and you can get to Canada. So those are things, besides the cost perspective, the passenger experience is very, very important as well. And I want to highlight, again, keeping where it's very, very impactful if we can bring the broader voice. So we're very proud of our partnership with the Hotel Association, with the International Air Transport Association, again, the CAC and the Tourism Industry Association, and we come under what we call the National Roundtable on Travel and Tourism. And again, where it makes sense, we make joint submissions. In fact, we made joint submission to the CTA review panel, and we come together as often as we can. So coming back to the CTA review and some of the positions we've been taking, there's no question that the single biggest challenge that's limiting the aviation sector's growth is the highly uncompetitive nature of the cost infrastructure, the cost structure. We call it the unvarnished reality is that airlines around the world are supported by more progressive policies. And as Professor Lazar mentioned, we're not talking about subsidies here. I mean, there's you can be anywhere on the spectrum of government support, but we shouldn't. So you've got the Middle East carriers, which we're never going to be there, and that's not the point. But we shouldn't be at the other end of the spectrum. And I have a few examples here and this will be a common theme, I'm sure, where the sector is treated as a source of revenue. So you've got a user pay system, but it's been distorted, it's been mutated into an overpay system. So we shouldn't be at that end of the spectrum where the sector is used as a source of revenue. We should give the sector the breathing room it needs to be more competitive and keep doing what it does best, create jobs, stimulate trade and travel. So in contrast, this is what I've been talking about. In Canada, we've seen the sector as an easy and infinite source of revenue. And I think it's every 2 years, the World Economic Forum does a really thorough ranking of many aspects of the industry, including the third-party taxes and fees that are added to the base fare. And Canada is consistently at the bottom. And in the last report, we have the 9th highest third-party taxes and fees. So I want to just briefly talk about 2 examples of these fees that have been distorted and aren't reflective of the user pay policy. The first one is it's called the air travel security charge, so the security fee. So it's important to note this is the fee that's added to the ticket. The passenger is asked to pay the special dedicated charge, and it's supposed to fund the passenger screening. However, what's been happening, if you can read these numbers here, the government collects roughly, we're almost at $700 million per year now in this particular charge. But what it's been giving to the agency, CATSA, to do its job, there's almost $100 million a year. Well, last year was almost $100 million a year. And what we've seen since 2010 is this gap here between what the government collects and what it gives to the agency has resulted in a surplus of $360 million. So again, if we're going to have a user pay system, let's really have a user pay system. And there's two things you can do here. If you think CATSA doesn't need all the money, which it likely needs more money because we're seeing longer lineups, but if you think that, then reduce the security fee. But if you think CATSA needs all the money, then give CATSA all the money. So that's the frustrating part from our perspective is we have this user pay system, but it's been distorted. And these numbers are exacerbated by passenger growth. So we have more passengers traveling, and CATSA has less resources to do its job. Oh, okay. These are, so the second one I wanted to give an example is airport rent. And I know airport rent in many circles, people's eyes glaze over. It's a boring topic. But the reality is that it accounts for about a third of what the government collects from the industry. It's about $300 million per year. And again, none of it is reinvested back into aviation. We understand that at the time, it had a purpose. The taxpayer is and was entitled to a reasonable return on the investment. So when the airports were transferred to local airport authorities, they sit on Crown land, and the taxpayer was entitled to some sort of return. However, what's been happening is the value of the airports when they were transferred, I've been generous here, they're about $2.9 billion, so $3 billion just for argument's sake. But rent, and this is growing every year, the government has received over $5 billion. So there's this $2 billion surplus here that, again, rent is being used as a source of revenue, and that's part of the frustration. So jumping back to the CTA review, and what does the CTA review say about how do we make the sector more competitive? So this is coming back to those two prongs. This would be on the first prong, being competitive from a cost perspective. Well, we need to reform the user pay policy. Two easy fixes, just the numbers I just talked about, the ATSC and airport rent. Address airport fees and charges. Some airports do a very good job. Some airports, there's room for improvement on understanding the needs of airlines. We're in favor of more consultation, making sure that capital improvements are judicious. So there's room there to reduce those, we believe. And I found this particularly interesting, and I guess I'll be an internal optimist, but the report actually encouraged the federal government to work with provinces and then to make the sector more competitive. But very interestingly, it specifically talks about aviation fuel taxes. Now, there's only a few provinces left in Canada who still have a tax on international fuel, and it's Ontario. And Ontario is really an outlier, first of all, in the fact that it still has an international fuel tax, but the amount of it. It was recently increased by 148%. So I guess we're seeing that as now that we have maybe the federal and the Ontario government, they could be seen as cousins, maybe there'll be that incentive to look at Ontario's fuel tax and bring Ontario in line with the rest of the world. So that's an encouraging recommendation, and we look forward to see what the federal government has in mind. So on the passenger experience side of things, on how do we make the sector more competitive? Well, we continue what we're doing. There's no question that border security, immigration policy, they're all very important. They all protect us. But there is a reality that they do, if they're not done properly, they do make Canada less attractive. Again, I was talking about this, making it easy to come to Canada. In Canada, we're going to be establishing, it's been delayed a few times, but I guess as of September now, our friends in most Western European countries that presently don't need to do anything to come to Canada, except buy their ticket and come do business or come see their friends and family, will now have to obtain what's called an electronic travel authorization. It's very similar to the American ESTA program. So luckily it looks like it's going to be light touch, but again, there's another fee to it. But what we've been asking, and I do want to acknowledge the new government in this, is we've been saying, okay, so now that you have this new tool, and we know that visas are burdensome and they deter people to come to Canada, can you apply this new tool to countries such as Mexico? We're part of NAFTA together, and the government has committed to doing so. So that's fantastic news. If we're going to use the ETA to its full potential, then we will see value from it. So things like that, novel progressive thinking about how to make it easier to come to Canada. And then we need to make sure that we're all aligned when we think about what are our priority markets, where do we need to make investments. All departments, we need to have this holistic approach to it. That's not always been the case, and I think there's room for improvement there as well. So those were just my opening remarks, and I look forward to the discussion. And thank you again.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this symposium, and particularly on this panel discussing competition Canada's airline with a focus on the CTA review. Although David Emerson's mandate was to look forward 20 to 30 years to identify priorities and potential actions in transportation that will support Canada's long-term economic well-being, our critical approach to the report is based on whether or not the recommendations support the long-term development of the air transport industry in Canada. What is good for air transport is usually good for the Canadian economy. We note with interest the following about the recommendations. Many of them were not tabled by stakeholders, but are suggested by the authors of the report themselves. The likelihood of these recommendations ever being implemented was not a factor. They were not based on their business, financial, or political feasibility or acceptability. And the 10 recommendations in the air transport and the other 50 recommendations of the report were not prioritized. This means that the Emerson report is shouldering the minister with these considerations in his analysis. ATAC is still consulting its members through our committees and our boards, and will be drafting a formal, detailed response, which we plan to issue in June. However, I can give you a pretty good idea of what we support, what we oppose, and what we're still debating in as far as the recommendations found in Chapter 9 on aviation are concerned. Our formal response, however, will also include comments on many other chapters, including governance, the North, and the CTA. We certainly endorse the review of the user pay policy in drawing on general government revenues to support a secure and accessible system that serves northern and remote regions. We support phasing out airport rents, more reasonable in-year municipal taxes for airports, a shared capital structure for airports, but with conditions, requiring airports to grant access to airlines, tying AIF to specific projects with sunset provisions, getting airline expertise on airport authorities' boards of directors, streamlined immigration and customs processes, transit to Canadian airports without visas, and improved passenger connectivity, and expanding the Trusted Traveler program. We strongly support requiring CTA complainants to have been a customer of the operator against whom the complaint is lodged, as we made that recommendations ourselves. We also support harmonization. Is that where? Yes, I am. Harmonization's ICAO standards by Canada must reflect the differences between aviation segments and the specificity of the northern and remote operating conditions. And finally, reducing the air traveler security charge and making it a dedicated tax or fee to be set periodically by CATSA in order to fulfill its mandate. An ATAC study in 2008 indicated that at the time, Canada had the second highest security charge in the world, second only to Holland. Not to be outdone, however, the Canadian government increased the ATSC by 52% in 2010. We're quite sure that Canada has the highest security charge in the world. Also, and as mentioned by Marc-André, we're very concerned that the government annually collects over $100 million more than the CATSA budget allocated by Parliament. We clearly do not support foreign ownership greater than 59%, but even that has to be reciprocal. 100% foreign ownership of cargo and specialty operators, although some Canadian airports see in that an opportunity to develop major North American cargo hubs. Passenger rights legislation, which doesn't factor in shared responsibility. And we are still questioning whether shouldering CATSA with both the regulatory oversight and operations is the only solution, and providing the CTA with the power to conduct investigations on its own motion without limitations. Well, I look forward to hearing comments from both the panel and the audience on all of these issues. I thank you very much.
My name is Daniel Robert Gooch, and I'm president of the Canadian Airports Council. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here today. I actually was going to wear my Sharks tie because I was swimming with you guys, but I wore my Air Cadets tie instead. So we're going to go with the charm offensive. The Canadian Airports Council has 50 members from coast to coast to coast. They include small airports like Charlottetown and Prince George, but also the larger commercial airports like Vancouver International and Toronto Pearson. Our members include all privately owned NAS airports in the country. As an organization, we contributed extensively to the CTA review report over the last year, and we're pleased to see that much of what we submitted is actually reflected in the report. We recommended, for example, that Mr. Emerson go beyond the mandate of the Minister of Transport to consider areas of visa policy and border programs, and we're pleased to see these considered in a section on global hubs in recognition of the importance of international traffic for growth in our industry. What we have heard from the review is a healthy endorsement of what our sector has been able to accomplish over the past 25 years since an earlier review of air transport ultimately led to the devolution of airports. Large airport authorities have successfully fulfilled their mandates to develop or renew infrastructure through capital investment while remaining self-sufficient. Saying that, several of our smaller NAS airports, 6 in particular, have ongoing challenges with covering operating costs and their capital needs. Much of this is operational and safety related, such as runway work in Charlottetown and Prince George. Through a perverse interpretation of the National Airports Policy, these 6 airports that I mentioned have been barred from participating in any of the federal infrastructure programs that exist today and that non-NAS airports have access to. We appreciate the folly of this being recognized in the review, but these airports are seeking a change now. This is an active file of concern for airports. I know the slides don't always seem to match with my words. I didn't want to put slides that I was reading, so they're meant to complement. It's not that we're off slides. Cost competitiveness is one of the top concerns of Canada's air transport sector, and we know it's the #1 concern for many of the air carriers in the country. The CAC is broadly supportive of the review's recommendations in this area. Certainly, we can support recommendations on phasing out rent and increasing capital assistance for small airports, for example. My colleague spoke rather eloquently to the matter of rent. It is a $300 million a year bill. It's unhelpful to talk about expensive airports without understanding and speaking to what is underpinning that. And it is $5 billion since airports were transferred, not $3 billion. We also can be supportive of consumer protection of airline passengers if this is done smartly. We don't share Dr. Lazar's contempt for the airline passenger. We recognize in the industry that none of us would have jobs if it wasn't for the consumer. We have concerns with the European model, of course, and we're prepared to work collaboratively with air carriers to avoid unintended consequences in this area. I don't think any of us want to return to an area where air transport is a heavily regulated sector. That's certainly not anybody's interests. On air sector regulation and certification, while this appears to be, the recommendations in the section appear to be primarily of interest to the aerospace sector and aircraft operators, we're certainly sympathetic, and it underpins some of the concerns that we have with resources for Transport Canada. It's important that Transport Canada have the resources to do its important work as our industry regulator. Indeed, I'll be reaching out to my colleagues. I had a couple of conversations with government yesterday. We'll be reaching out with our colleagues to see if there are ways that we can draw attention to the collective concerns of industry on this area. This brings me to airport ownership and governance. On airport ownership in particular, the CAC's NAS airports have a variety of views on the recommendations in the report, most notably the recommendation to move to a share capital model within 3 years for the larger airports. We are in agreement, however, that the government should proceed cautiously in this area and review the matter in full consultation with industry. Some of our members are interested in exploring the privatization model a bit further to understand what it would entail, and we will be exploring the topic in greater detail with government. While most of our airports seem to favor the current model, Airports are meeting with their boards, as I'm sure you can imagine at this time, and are formulating their own opinions on the topic. The review also recommends legislation with principles on pricing, mandating airline expertise on airport authority boards, new requirements for consultation around capital projects, and other areas. Airports have been down this road before. Indeed, much of what has been put forward in the recommendations is already in place at most Canadian airports. The propensity to dish rhetoric without really understanding what the situation is on the ground in each of the communities is something that most of us in the industry have moved beyond, because we realize that it's not helpful and that we have more that unites us than what divides us. But we will look at what Transport Canada proposes in this area, and we will respond appropriately. Airports are not opposed to change, but it has to be well thought out, and it should address real problems, not just perceived problems. Airport authorities today are complex organizations with existing employee groups and debt holders with billions of dollars in airport infrastructure-related debt. Any moves to change the ownership or governance of airports must take this into account, which is why we urge the government to proceed cautiously. Again, I don't think we want to return to the days of a heavily regulated air transport sector. Airport security and CATSA, recommendation 6. Airports support these recommendations. In fact, they likely will be the top priority for airports as we continue to deal with chronic wait time challenges, particularly at large gateway airports. As a community of airports, we have a lot of respect for the difficult work undertaken by Angus Watt and the team at CATSA. However, CATSA doesn't have any control over its funding, which has not kept pace with demand for service. We're enjoying great growth in the industry, but unfortunately the resources for CATSA have just not kept pace. We don't question the value of the security value of the work conducted by CATSA, but air travelers are paying one of the highest security fees in the world, and they are not receiving value for money in terms of passenger service. This should be a concern for all of us. And there may be more coming. Funding for CATSA to perform the non-passenger screening component of its mandate doesn't exist past next year. Even though we believe the Government of Canada is raising more than enough money from the Air Traveller Security Charge to cover this on an ongoing basis, last year Transport Canada floated the idea that non-passenger screening be transferred to airports from an operational and financial perspective, with a $150 million a year price tag for that. We push back. We say we believe it would be inappropriate to go down that road without dealing with the bigger challenges associated with screening in this country. We just need to fix the model. We need to do it across the whole system, the breadth of CATSA's mandate, not just one component at a time. At the end of the day, airports want a world-class air transport security system, one that applies resources to the areas of greatest risk and ensures that both air travelers and industry workers are able to get through Canada's airports securely and efficiently. And we want this to happen without simply heaping more costs onto industry, which has been government's approach in the past, hopefully only in the past. So where does this all go? What's the point? Past reviews have led to substantive attempts at air transport policy reform. Many of them have been successful. Transport Canada has indicated to us that it aims for a fall timeline to present a package of policy, legislative, and regulatory changes to the Minister of Transport and ultimately Cabinet. The point of this exercise, as Mr. Emerson saw it, was to reduce costs, increase connectivity, and improve service. These are all good objectives, and we should keep them in mind as we proceed. We expect the recommendations on airport ownership to take a bit longer to work through, but by the fall we do hope to see reforms to improve cost competitiveness for the sector through a less rigid adherence to user pay, measures to improve competition in the domestic and international sectors, and federal funding program changes so that small NAS airports can receive the same, can compete for the same level of funding from the federal government as enjoyed by other similarly sized airports. And finally, we hope to see, by the fall, a permanent fix for screening. Not a quick fix or short-term funding, but approach that meets the needs of our industry and of our passengers and workers so that we can concentrate on growing Canada's air transport footprint more effectively and competing in the world. Thank you.
I have to say that when I was asked to moderate this panel, initially I thought, oh God, competitive issues, that's kind of boring. But when I hear words like pathetic and perverse, I think the panel has spiced it up a little bit, and there's a reason we've got Daniel at one end and Fred at the other end. So there's been a lot of talk about governance with the airports, and I think that might have been when Fred used the word pathetic. Pilots love being in control. What's the position of the association that you represent with respect to having customers on the boards of some of the airport authorities, like Airline Association personnel, like Pilot Association folks like that. You know, I heard Senator Housakis say earlier that Ottawa was voted #1 and #2. From a pilot perspective, Ottawa is a great airport, but one of the most heavily used runways in Ottawa, runway 25, has only a non-precision approach servicing the airport. So that's a classic case of where pilots, if they were on the board, they'd be saying to the airport authority, you know, we'd love to have a precision approach for all the obvious reasons on runway 25. So if you want to kick that one off, and then maybe Fred or anybody else in the panel wants to jump in.
That's a great example. Ottawa International Airport had Mike Skrbika of the Air Transport Association of Canada on his board for many years. Airports are not opposed to having airline expertise on their boards. They want it, they support it. In fact, in our submission to Minister Garneau in response to CTA, we're going to be including a chart that shows the expertise by airport authority that's already there. The challenge is the individuals can't be conflicted. They can't be existing employees of an air carrier, and they need to put forward, they need to be there for their skills, not because they're going to weigh in for one particular carrier or the other. Airport authorities have to balance the needs of a spectrum of interests, a spectrum of stakeholders. They're responsive to the communities that they serve the needs of the carriers in their community, but also they care about air passengers. So there are a variety of views to be balanced in airport authorities, and they have skills-based boards to support that, and that includes a lot of air carrier expertise today. I think the challenge is when we start to get into imposing rules, and then you get into sort of issues of one airport versus another. The ability for someone in Montreal at Aéroport de Montréal to source somebody with air carrier expertise for their boards is quite rich. Montreal is, of course, headquarters to 2 carriers and industry associations and everything else. Charlottetown, it's another matter. So happy to have those conversations. In fact, we were engaged in them over the course of the last year, and airports agreed to make commitments on best practice. Make commitments on best abilities to get these individuals on airport authority boards, but a lot of them are already there.
Thanks, Daniel. Did you want to add anything to that, Fred?
Yeah, I just make the following comments. I mean, there are really 2 big issues with sort of the airports. One is sort of compensation of the executive management team. And again, you've got the problem sort of worldwide, how that's done. And the boards really are not effective in controlling compensation. And the other is sort of the capital expenditures. And again, the boards are not effective in doing that. The various people who have been appointed to the boards, I'm sure they're wonderful individuals, but they're not going to challenge. And my view on sort of boards in general is the CEOs or no other executive of the company should ever be on the board. They're hired hands. So until you start addressing those issues, you can put anybody you want on the board. You can come up with all types of skill requirements, which I think are nonsensical. Just have people with good common sense that are willing to challenge, willing to stand up to the management team.
Okay, thanks. You look like you want to say something.
Well, I just want to say it's very refreshing to hear Daniel say that, and we certainly endorse that. Now, the quality of a board is based, and the usefulness of a board is determined by the quality of the talent on the board. And to include people that from airline background, we agree with you that these should not be airline employees. But there are many people available out there who don't work for airlines, should be there. And of course, clients, the customers, we certainly support that.
Thanks. One of the issues that was identified in the CTA review was the issue of foreign ownership. And maybe this one's for Marc-André. You know, I found it interesting that they're talking about raising the level of foreign ownership. And typically when that's done, that's to provide for more ability to raise capital. And it doesn't appear that many of the members that you represent, Air Canada, WestJet, Jazz, Transat, et cetera, have had any issue with raising capital with the current ownership limits the way they are.
I don't, we don't have a position as a council. We have different opinions on that, so I can't really speak to that. But maybe just mention that, yeah, I mean, listen, we talked about ultra low cost carriers and the barriers to entry, and these things don't operate in a vacuum, and we would point to the high environment, the high cost environment as a factor as well. But that, I don't want to get into too much of a foreign ownership from our perspective.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't think anybody sees, I don't think anybody's promoting greater than 49% foreign ownership in Canada. And I was surprised to read that in the review saying at least 49%. We certainly don't think that's a necessity. I haven't heard any of the airlines, be they ATAC members or our members, ever mention that that was a necessity. And we certainly oppose 100% ownership of specialty operators. We certainly don't understand where that came from. We suspect that some airports would like to develop maybe cargo hubs and so on and so forth, but the short term and even the long term results of that would be loss of jobs in Canada.
Right. Yeah, that was a special concern for us as well, and we were a little, puzzled as to why the 100% ownership was there for cargo, and we're always puzzled why cargo is treated so differently in every respect, whether it's flight and duty time issues south of the border, et cetera. But yeah, that one seemed to come out of nowhere.
Good morning, Robert Fulton. On the subject of airport improvement fees, I'm a very strong safety advocate. We spend a lot of money as passengers and crew members who do commute. The funds that actually are being collected, why are they not being used for things like approach aids, ground-based approach aids? Example, Halifax, the recent accident that happened with Air Canada. That was a probably preventable. Don't want to be any type of an assumption but Halifax. You spoke strongly of Charlottetown. Halifax itself, being one of the worst environmental areas in Canada, has got probably the worst approach aids. So why are we not taking these airport improvement fees and putting it, instead of putting lipstick on the actual airport surfaces, we should be using that to improve our approach aids for pilots?
Thanks, Robert. And I just want to add a little bit to that, and I'll probably let you handle that first, Daniel. One of the things, obviously, a non-precision approach isn't inherently an unsafe approach. So I want to say that right off the bat, but I certainly agree that, and I think the TSB has made this a big issue on their watch list, unstable approaches, and having a precision approach gives you a higher probability of having a stable approach. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel for his comments.
Certainly, I'm not a pilot, so I can't really weigh in on technical or the specific projects that an individual airport authority will pursue. But there are consultative committees within each airport where air carriers do have the ability to put forward what they would like to see in terms of infrastructure investments. I mean, one of the comments that was made that I find kind of insulting is the insinuation that all of the investments that have been made in airports are into terminals. A lot of investments certainly have been made in terminals because they hadn't been upgraded during many years of the federal government's ownership and operation of airports, but also because we want to diversify the revenue that airports are able to generate to reduce the dependence on aeronautical charges. So, the beautiful terminals are producing money that helps offset the aeronautical charges. Many of the upgrades that are taking place around the country won't be visible to the passenger because they are taking place outside of the terminal. Prince George, Charlottetown, St. John, I understand they're all working on their runways. Prince George had put off the work that they needed for a few years because we were trying to get changes to federal infrastructure funding programs so that these could be paid for without having to increase the AIF. So, airports are cognizant of the challenge, the economic challenge that AIFs pose. and that increasing those, is not desirable. But this is the mechanism that we have in this country today to raise infrastructure, to raise funding for infrastructure. It's the model that we have. It is in some ways more expensive, but it has reduced the reliance on the taxpayer. So, I guess we have some decisions to make this year. John?
My only comment on that is that my experience on the ACCs is that they review projects put forward by airports more so than suggest or initiate projects themselves. That's a case in point for having airline expertise on a board of an airport authority.
Yeah. Now, I just add 2 points. I think your comment just reinforced what I said. The expertise on the board just is not there to consider such safety issues. And then the airports have also gotten carried away with, let's make this sort of a destination. And the reality is, if passengers have that much time to spend wandering through the airports, that means we're really inefficient in getting them through to the gate, onto the plane, and out of the airport.
I mean, listen, we are in favor of airports being able to maximize their non-aeronautical revenue to be able to offset. So there is that balance. And in fact, we've proposed this whole airport rent formula to create an incentive for airports to focus on non-aircraft revenue, to offset landing fees. If that stream of revenue was exempt from the rent calculation. So I understand, and safety, again, I don't know enough about that particular issue, but airlines and airports try to work together through these consultative committees and agree on what's a priority for that year. I think it works well at some airports, and there is area for improvement at other airports, there's no question.
If I may just follow up on Marc-André's point, because he made an excellent point. The rent that's paid by airports comes off the top line revenues. And so if airports find, which is one of the peculiarities of the way the National Airports Policy is implemented today. So if airports find a new business line that they can go into that will create a revenue that they can use to offset other businesses, if they're an ass airport, they have to look at that percentage that's taken off the revenue that goes to the federal government, because that's a percentage that another business, another competitive business wouldn't have to pay. And so just a simple change to the rent formula really can incent a lot of good economic activity. I think you see airports kind of trying to get around the situation with rent to do things in creative ways. If we just sort of change the formula, that would be one good way to improve the economic prospects.
Thanks, Daniel. And the big red light is flashing here. We're out of time for this panel. I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for taking time out of what we know is very busy schedules and for offering very candid and expert comments. Very helpful. I hope the audience found it useful. And on behalf of all 52,000 pilots at ALPA, we certainly appreciate your participation today, and it was a pleasure sharing the stage with you. Thank you.